Hey, everybody. Welcome back for another episode. Today, we're going to be kicking off something kind of special, I think. We're going to be kind of starting, you can consider this a new series. Um, Although it's adjacent to a lot of the things that we talk about on this channel, that I talk about on the channel, I'm going to kind of be coming at it from a different perspective. And as you can tell by the thumbnail, Origins of Coal. I'll be kicking off this series with an article from 1842. Um, Talking about the origins of coal and why this is so important and why coal can be such a remarkable catalyst to new lines of inquiry, thinking, and a very important lens when it comes to looking at the past, what shaped our realm, cataclysms, and how we can use that to better understand the evolution or the circular kind of motion that this realm seems to rotate around, so to say. Um, in this, we're going to talk about geological formations, coal, minerals, oil, natural gas, um, biogeology, all kinds of things along these lines, and how they've helped me shape my opinions. And we're going to talk about our tropical past. This is going to be fun. It's going to be a fun way to kind of talk about dinosaurs, um, yeah, and many of the other things that I just listed off, but kind of from a bit of a different perspective. So it'll be a little bit of old material we've covered already. For people that have been following me, especially on Twitter for a few years, they know that I've talked about this subject not extensively, but fairly openly as to my opinions. And you can kind of see the hints in the thumbnail. We're going to make correlations between petrified trees, petrified forests, standing forest, buried forest. What is coal? What's in coal? How did coal come about? Does it take millions of years? Can it happen in an instant? Things along those lines. And in this article, we're going to kind of come at it from more of a, just again the archaeologist, the geologist in the mid to late 1840s, they had a lot more freedom to speak openly about certain subjects, and mineralogy and mining were quite a special specialized. I mean, they are specialized today, but in this time frame, it really makes you think who these mining companies are, who operates the mining companies, and what their knowledge of past historical events really is. I'm going to tell you that even in the 1800s, these mining companies and the people that operated them and owned them and the kind of things they were uncovering and witnessing, I feel this was not surprising, and they were far from treading lightly, and that there was kind of a race, so to say, to snatch up the minerals. In this realm, we may not be told exactly the size and dimensions and uh, the true extent of it all, but there does seem to be a race for what lies beneath, covering up, um, grabbing a hold of it, and that certain things are very limited. And this ties in also with the radium series quite nicely. I talked a little bit in that series about how it was found, raised, and pitchblende in the oil industry, as well as coal, play very vital roles in all of this. So we'll talk about radium a little bit, but for the most part, that'll be kind of its own separate thing. But yeah, thanks for being here. Let's get right into the article here. I'm looking forward to this. Um, I just have so much material, so it's going to be important to start working our way through it. So again, 1847, Mr. Lyell's fifth lecture on geology, the origin of coal. In speaking of the different strata of which the Earth's crust is composed, those, at least, which contain organic remains, I spoke of them as so many volumes of history, as so many monuments of the ancient states of the globe, and of their different structures as being so many leaves of these volumes. All that I can do in this short course of lectures is to take down at random first one and then another of these volumes, and endeavor not to give you any idea of the contents of the whole, but just to express something of the method employed in the attempt to decipher these ancient memorials of the Earth's history. Now, the volume which I intend to take down tonight is that which we term the coal formation, and I shall speak of it only so far as to show the relative position and the state of the different periods when they were deposited beneath the water. Now, um, really important thing to think about here too. Those familiar with my work, they already know that I have quite a fringe opinion about the past, events that may have taken place to create certain geological positions and formations in this realm. And yeah, so, although I may not agree with everything the author's stating, this is kind of like a introduction into the subject and kind of a groundwork. And some of my other videos will also kind of help build that same framework. But as we get into the further episodes, we're gonna we're gonna show the correlations a little bit finer detail. And again, looking at the subject from 1,000 feet is going to be really important here. Now, when I term this formation coal, I merely mean this assemblage of strata which rests on the older sandstone and in which is found that valuable fuel we call coal. And although the quantity in which it is contained is very small in comparison with the bulk and volume of other strata, there is still great interest and importance attached to it. We see that in going from the highest to the lowest beds yet discovered, the coal occupies quite an ancient position, one indicating a formation low down in the sea, as we have above it the most modern formations. We have first the post Pleistocene, then the tertiary formations, then the chalk, which is made up of calcareous matter formed mostly, at least in Europe, from decomposed shells and coals of those green marls which are found in New Jersey and of such extensive use in agriculture. Then we have the Jura limestone, or oolite, in which also are masses of coral, like the common coral reefs. Below this are two other groups, of which I shall not speak at present. And lastly, we come down to the Carboniferous or coal berry stratum, which rests upon the thick sandstone beds, or the limestone containing corals, and which, like every other formation, contains species of animals, shells, and plants of different species from these immediately antecedent or following. I apologize. Below this again, we see limestone and shale, which enter most largely into the structure of the rocks of the state of New York and which abound in fossils. Now, a great change must have been experienced before the coal period when the fossils were deposited. I am indebted to Mr. Sopwith an eminent civil engineer, for copies of some models prepared by him for those sections, which are faithful and accurate representations of actual localities, as has been fully verified by Dr. Buckland and myself in examinations which are made last spring. The different strata of limestone, shale, and conglomerate of which the Carnivorous Formation is composed are here represented. The sections represent facts ascertained in cutting perpendicularly through the Newcastle Coal District. There are not hypothetical, but are founded upon exact measurements. In one of these sections, you see the dip of the beds is at an angle of 20 degrees, while the slope of the valley is 40 degrees. In the other, the dip is 50 degrees, and the slope of the valley in the same direction is 20 degrees. Now, just take some time to think about that. I know that can be a bit confusing. I'll read it again. In one of these sections, you see the dip of the beds is at an angle of 20 degrees, while the slope of the valley, which is steeper, is at 40 degrees. In the other, the dip is 50 degrees, and the slope of the valley in the same direction is 20 degrees. In these two cases, therefore, the relation of the slope of the valley and the dip of the beds is reversed. In both cases, also the slope of the valley and the dip of the beds are to the south. To those who are not acquainted with these technical terms, I may say that the deviation from a horizontal plane of the beds is called the dip, while the strike, as it is called, is the extension of the strata in a direction at right angles to the dip. In this case, as the dip is to the south, the strike must be from the east to west. The flexures of the valley depend on their inclination relatively to the dip. And these two sections cut through beds of coal and shale and sandstone. The shale being in indern, indunated. I don't know. Apologize. Can't read that word. Indunated clay are illustrations of cases in which the two strata come up to the surface according to the various relations to the slope of the valley and the dip of the bed. It is a rule among miners that when the dip of the beds is less steep than the slope of the valley in the same direction, then the V's, as they are termed, will point upwards, those formed by the newer beds appearing in a superior position and extending higher up the valley. But when the case is reversed and the dip of the bed is steeper than the slope of the valley, then the V's point downwards and those formed of the older beds appear uppermost. These rules may often be of great practical service in many cases. For example, suppose a miner first to begin his operations in one valley with the structure of which he is familiar. If he would sink his shaft through the formations above, he would come to the coal which is below. But suppose one unacquainted with these rules which I have been explaining to go to another valley, and in England he might easily go to such a valley, for these cases, as I said, are not hypothetical. He might, continuing along the same side of the hills as he had seen in other valleys, where he observed the same outcropping, as it is termed, of the coal seams. Suppose reasoning from his former experience that he might begin his workings in the bed at the higher part of the valley, with the expectation of coming down to the other bed. But he would be disappointed, as you will readily see by observing that the uppermost bed is lowest down in the valley, and the lower bed is the highest up. This you can easily trace with your eye upon these sections. An acquaintance of these rules and their application is of the greatest importance to those speculating in mining transactions. In the coal field of Pennsylvania, to which I shall presently allude, near Pottsville, I saw an exemplification this year of the two cases alluded to, when in the coal of the same valleys, the V's in some cases pointed one way, and in the other in the opposite, the dip and the slope being both towards the south. There is nothing more singular which has struck me so forcibly in respect to the coal fields of this country as their close resemblance to those of the north of Europe, and of England in particular. I have traveled on the north side of the Alps toward the south, and have been astonished to find minerals of fossils of entirely distinct genre from those met with in the Pyrenees, nor have the chains of the mountains anything to do with this remarkable change, for the beds were formed at the bottom of the sea before the mountains existed. Now, here's obviously there are a lot of things throughout this that are not entirely accurate. He's giving distinct examples of certain areas. Now we have thousands and thousands of coal seams that cross paths or meet at right angles and don't follow this principle. He's alluding to the northern hemisphere following this very closely. And he's talking about how the mountains have little to no effect. Now, this is incredibly important. They don't change the seams. And also, he's saying that the coal beds lie underwater only. Now, we know this isn't factual. At least he's only representing a very small portion of the realm. America has more coal than all of Europe and Asia combined. In fact, there are coal beds in Middle America, the Dakotas, Wyoming, Montana that can be hundreds of feet thick and tens of thousands of square miles. How is that possible? Okay. Now, as we get further along and we talk about the creation of coal, we're going to get into the bio element of coal, the timeline concepts of coal, why fossils are so prevalent in coal, how that could be, the anomalies that exist in coal beds, coal mines. We've talked about them on this channel quite a few times, but never under the guise of a focused section, focusing just on this type of formation. How these artifacts, skeletons, humans in some cases, completely destroy the Pleistocene, million of year, hundred of thousands of year narrative. And we'll be showing more evidence that coal can, in fact, be created in hours. And I think with the right circumstance, in minutes. And that these coal beds of huge extent and their origins being what's really the key of our past and why it's being so thoroughly hidden from us. So back to the article. Observing this great change, then, in the short passage of a few hundred miles, it seems to me most surprising that in passing, at the distance of 3 or 4 thousand miles from England to the Appalachian chain of Virginia, we should find the coal measures the same as though we left behind, represented in the red sandstone and containing white grit and slaty shales, and clays not slaty in beds of conglomerate containing quartz pebbles. It is generally admitted by geologists that all that fuel, which we call coal, is of vegetable origin. If there has been any dispute with regard to this, it was settled when a portion of the Newcastle coal some years ago was submitted to a microscopic examination. After cutting off a slice so thin that it should transmit light, it was found that in many parts of the pure and solid coal in which geologists had no suspicion that they should be able to detect any vegetable structure, not only were the annual rings of the growth of several kinds of trees beautifully distinct, but even the medullary rays, and what is still more remarkable, in some cases, even the spiral vessels could be discerned. But besides these proofs from observing a vegetable structure in the coal itself, there has been found in the shales accompanying it fern leaves and branches, as well as other plants. And when we find the trunks of trees and the bark and the barks inverted, I don't converted. There we go. And the bark converted into the same kind of coal as we find in the great solid beds. No one will dispute the strong evidence in favor of the vegetable origin of this coal. If we find a circumference of bark surrounding a cylindrical mass of sand, we know it has been a hollow tree filled up with sand, nor can there be any doubt that the coal is formed of vegetable matter. No less than 300 species of plants have been well determined by botanists, some of whom have devoted a great part of their lives to this study. From this, it is to be inferred that the carnivorous formation of Europe and America is made up of comparatively recent plants. I will allude to three or four of the most peculiar facts that led to this conclusion. Again, for a lot of my longtime subscribers and people that have been following my work for a long time, not striking. I get far more into the kind of meat and potatoes of coal, but for this geologist to be speaking so matter of fact and saying that despite them, and them I mean by geologists in the early 1800s, stating there's no way it was common knowledge that the coal layer was not of vegetable matter, that it became inconclusive fact, undeniable fact, sorry, that that's exactly what this coal layer is made of. And it covers the entire northern hemisphere. And as this man has stated, he finds almost exactly the same type of formations thousands of miles apart. Now, how is that possible? We're going to get into the creation of oceans. What are the continents? What is landmass? Is it vegetable matter? What type of structure could have been destroyed? Because that's what has to happen for coal to be created. Something has to be destroyed. And what could have been destroyed in such a abrupt manner to petrify and or liquefy much of the globe? Could this be related to the deluge? Could the deluge have been a subterranean eruption? Well, these coal veins and the way they form in their different slopes and angles and the crossing of seams is showing you this, in my opinion, that there have been that the realm in which we inhabit sits on top of a liquid barrier, and that is plastic in a sense. And through several events, this skin has moved, and in some places, a great deal, a great distance. And that when this skin moves and drags and separates and pulls apart, that you get these kind of scabs, so to say. You get these formations that show this kind of upheaval. And as the thumbnail showed, I allude that the coal seam or seams were created of tropical vegetation, of gigantic megafauna, and that within these coal seams we find dragons, terrifying lizards, dinosaurs, whatever you want to call them, absolutely gigantic mammals, reptiles, man, and trees so large they make our redwoods look like toothpicks. But yeah, back to the article. In the first place, the boughs and leaves of ferns are the most frequently and striking met in America as well as Europe. So perfectly have they been preserved that there can be no doubt that they are really ferns, and in some cases, even their inflorescence has been preserved at the back of the leaves. Where we have not the flowers and prints remaining, we have found it impossible to distinguish the different species of fossils and ancient ferns by attending to the veining of the leaves. At least 100 species are determined in this way. The most numerous of these vegetable veinings are those which have been called sigillaria, or tree ferns. Their stems are found to be fluted vertically, and the flutings are little stars, as it were, each of which indicates the place where the leaf was attached. And it is evident, as M. Adolphi Brongnart has shown, that they are recent tree ferns. One argument for believing in this that although the bark of these trees is so well marked that 42 species have been described, yet there is never found any leaf attached. While we have in the same beds loose leaves in abundance, which have no trunks. The natural inference is that they must have belonged to the arborescent ferns, as for instance the section named Canalopteris. Again, I apologize, it gets a little hard to read. Canal- Canalopteris is admitted by all to have belonged to this species. This fact is also important because the tree ferns, and especially the Canalopteris, are now known to be exclusively the inhabitants of a warm and humid climate. Man, I can't say it enough. Very important. You guys, again, for those familiar with my work, you've heard me talk endlessly about the age before the fall and that the realm was covered um, in tropical megafauna, and that we seem to have ample evidence that not only were the poles covered in tropical vegetation, as well as areas like Alaska and southern Tasmania, southern South America, um, but we also find m- magnificent creatures, giant reptiles in these same latitudes, and we'll get into a bit of that before we end this episode. Much more hot and moist than in those parts of the globe where coal now abounds. For we find coal not only in England and Nova Scotia, but as far north as Melville's Island and Baffin's Bay, in a climate where the growth of such fern plants is dwarfish and stinted. It is evident that when these vegetables existed, there must have been a warmer and probably a more equitable climate than now, even in warmer latitudes. So, what are they saying? They're saying that now, even more in the warmer latitudes. So, more, more likely to grow these. Now, this is gets to the megafauna situation. Okay, this is also relates to what I've been talking about with some of these terrible lizards of the giant reptiles, that their apparatus for breathing make absolutely no sense from a um, scientific standpoint. They shouldn't be able to breathe. Their lungs and nostrils and so forth are not antiquated for breathing in oxygen for an animal so large. Well, again, megafauna, mega everything only really works when we are dealing with much higher oxygen levels, as well as a much higher um, pressure, air pressure, density. I would say 50 to 100% higher, maybe even more. And the megafauna support this. And they're saying here that the kind of vegetable matter they're finding is even more, I would say, they're shying away from saying that it's even larger. Probability a more equitable climate than even now in the warmer latitudes. So take the warmer latitudes, and they still don't find things like this. That's because the not only did the climate change, the oxygen levels changed, and the air pressure changed. You need only go back to my vapor canopy. Was Noah's flood the fall of the vapor canopy? And I believe this vapor canopy is what was also not only contributing to very high CO2, but part of what was keeping the atmospheric pressure much higher, contributing not only to things lasting and living much longer, but to a far larger size. Giants, right? When we talk about Noah, whether or not you believe any of the biblical stuff, my videos on giants are endless, and giant creatures, they live longer and they get larger, and this correlates nicely to the higher CO2, higher atmospheric density theory. And the coal is supporting this narrative very strongly. All right, where were we? Back to the article. For even in the tropical zones where we meet with large developments of the calo- Calopteris, their general growth is much smaller than these fossil remains. So it is, so is it with all the plants of that tribe. Many of them of which we find fossil remains in the coal now exist only in the southern latitudes where no coal is found. The Araucaria we now find in Chile and other warmer parts of the globe, but never at the north, where its fossils abound in coal. The gigantic plants of the Equa, again, I apologize, it's hard for me to read this. The Equisitibarius tube are also found to be much smaller now in hot latitudes than are their fossil remains. Okay, so everything's larger in the coal. The coal beds are showing everything's bigger. Not only that, that the northern latitudes are showing the exact same type of hot, warm weather climate, tropical foliage, but of a greater scale. This would lead to the inference that the climate in northern latitudes was then much warmer and more moist than it is now in any other part of the globe. The same thing is made evident by a comparison of these fossil sigularia with those which now attain their greatest size in the islands of the Pacific. I have also found several plants, as the Asterophytes in the Appalachian chain this year, which I have also from Nova Scotia in Europe, and which cannot certainly be referred to any living families. These all, however, bespeak a terrestrial vegetation, though occasionally found mixed with marine shells and corals. Another class of fossils common in coal shales is the Lepidodendra, somewhat allied in form to the modern Lycopodemus or white mosses, though the mosses of the present day are never more than mere shrubs, even in the warmest regions. Yet at the carnivorous period, they attained an enormous development, being 50, 60, or 70 feet high. You guys, just wrap your mind around that, okay? Just think of a moss, right? Just think of moss today. I have a pathway in my front yard. All the stones are covered in moss. I have moss on the brick part of my front house. It's an inch thick. And in some places, I guess it can get like 3 inches, but that's like, it's super squishy, never much more than that, right? Yet at the carnivorous period, they attained an enormous development, being 50, 60, or even 70 feet high. It's mind blowing, right? Just think of the trees. Okay. And this is what we're alluding to as we get farther along here. Just think of the trees. They're going to be, I think, the biggest contributing factor to much of this coal. But just think the moss is that large. It's mind blowing. There have been two theories to explain how these plants could have been carried into the sea. Estuaries or lakes and drawn beneath the water and accumulated in the strata so as to form coal. One of them asserts that the plants must have been drifted and buried in the water, since we find them intercollected between different slates or shales, just as plants lie between the leaves of a botanist's herbarium, and are pressed together. So have these ferns been found tended between the seams of shale. They have been carried from the place where they grew, drifted out to a certain distance, waterlogged, and sunk in the mud and other strata deposited above them, so as to form this intercollection between the different leaves of clay. But many believed, from seeing the roots, that the plants grew on the spot where we are now find them. But when we come to observe that these roots terminate in different strata, it will seem evident that they were carried down, sunk, and stuck in the mud, as snags are now in the Mississippi. In the quartz rose and sandstone at Saint Etnin near Lyons are found a vast number of these lepidodendri and sigillaria. No one apparently can doubt that these drifted to their present position and that they were afterwards covered with sand brought down by rivers. Many appearances favor this hypothesis. Sometimes we find beds of marine shells, then vegetable matter, and then a mixture of fresh water and marine shells. But though these facts may thus explain the discoveries that are being made, lead geologists to come around more and more to the opposite views of the case, to the hypothesis which refers the growth of large beds of coal to the increase on the spot of the manner of peat as it is seen in cold and dark climates. This may appear contradictory to what I said with regard to a change of climate since the Carnivorous era, but it is not necessarily so. The opinion of Warner, confirmed by the speculation of Brongniart, led me to believe, contrary to my early impressions, that by far the greater part of the coal had grown in the spot where it is found, accumulating like peat on the land, and the land must have been submerged again and again to allow the strata of sand and mud to be superimposed as we find them. In excavating for coal at Belgrave near Glasgow in 1835, many upright trees were found with their roots terminating in a bed of coal. And only 3 years ago, in cutting a section of the Bolton Railroad in Lancashire, 8 or 10 trees were found in a vertical position. They were referable to the Lepidodendra species and allied to the Lipodemus or club mosses. All were within 10 or 50 feet of each other, and some of them were 15 feet in circumference at the bottom. The roots spread in all directions and reached beds of clay, and also spread out into the seams of coal. There is no doubt that these trees grew where they are found, and that the roots are in their original position. The seam of coal lies possibly between formed of the leaves which fell from the trees. There is a singular fact that just below the coal seam and above the covering of the roots was found more than a bushel of the Lepidostreus, a fruit not unlike the elongated cone of the fir tree. It has always been imagined that the Lip- Lepidostrebus was the fruit of the Dodendra, but there they found beneath other trees. So again, I apologize for mutilating all those Latin translations there, but finishing strong, right? Because again, so many fantastic, um, so much meat in that article. Um, Again, we're talking about um, even the geologists of these days having to completely rewrite their opinions of coal and its formation, showing that with the advent of the microscope, they were able to show undoubtedly that coal is made up of organic matter and That not only that, it contained megafauna, ferns, moss, so large it defies belief, and that they are continually finding, again, coal beds all around the world. They have found vertical forests in these coal beds. How is that even possible? Incredibly important, no matter what, going back through some of my previous episodes, we're going to find and kind of tear back the veil a bit on the geological formations, what they represent and what they mean. And yeah, so I'm going to wrap this episode up here as a bit of an introduction. And, I just love the newspapers as a medium. So this is kind of just laying the groundwork. Um, in the next episode, we're going to talk about subterranean forests, my opinions on how they're created, um, and other anomalies within coal beds. So stay tuned for that. Let me know in the comments what you think about this series and if you want more. Appreciate you all for tuning in as always. Have a wonderful day, guys.